Hey everyone, welcome to the Drive Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Attia. Hey Bob, how are you, man? Looking pretty studious there in the library today.
Hey Peter, thanks very much. Yeah, just getting some reading in before the podcast.
Well, this is going to be a pretty good one because, as you may recall, about 4 or 5 months ago, maybe longer, I was on a podcast with Tim Ferriss, and I don't know how it came up, but I do remember somehow it came up that, we had spent a lot of time writing this series, studying studies, and that's been 4 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
But we didn't really have something more digestible for folks on how to make sense of the ever-changing landscape of scientific literature, and in some ways how to kind of distinguish between the signal and the noise of the research news cycle. And I remember after that, Tim and I went out for dinner, and he kept sort of pressing me on, well, what can I do to get better at this process? Are there newsletters I should be subscribing to and things like that? And while I'm sure that there are, I didn't know what they were off the top of my head. And so I think what we've done here, when I say we, I mean you, what you have done here is kind of aggregate all the questions that have come in over the past year, basically, that pertain to understanding the structure of science. And I looked through the questions last week, and I was pretty excited. I think it's going to be a sweet discussion, and I hope this serves as an amazing primer for people to really understand the process of scientific experiments and everything from how studies are published and obviously what some of the limitations are. So anything else you want to add to that, Bob, before we jump in?
I agree. I think it's a fun topic. We get so many of these questions that we end up, or at least I do, or to the website, where we'll point readers to one of the parts of the studies. But I think sometimes just talking about it and explaining it can help a lot. So I think this will be really useful as far as like a question and answer session rather than just reading a blog.
Yeah. And I don't think this displaces that other stuff. I think we go into probably more detail on some things there, but I also think we're going to cover things here that aren't covered there. So depending on how you like to get your info, this could be fun. So where do you want to start?
So I think we have, again, a lot of questions, but I think this question gets to the core of I think what we're trying to do here, which is how can a user or a person who has no scientific background better understand studies that they read in the news or in the publications to know if the findings are solid or not, especially in today's age where you can easily see two studies that contradict each other. Coffee's good, coffee's bad. Eggs are good, eggs are bad. So I thought we could run through a bunch of questions with the first one that we got here is, what is the process for a study to go from an idea to design and execution?
Yeah, this is a great question. In theory, it should start with a hypothesis. Good science is generally hypothesis driven. So I think the cleanest way to think about that is to take the position that there is no relationship between two phenomena. So we would call this sort of a null hypothesis. So my hypothesis might be that drinking coffee makes your eyes turn darker. So I would have to state that hypothesis, and then I would have to frame it in a way that says, my null hypothesis is that when you drink coffee, your eyes do not change in color in any way, shape, or form. And that would imply that the alternative hypothesis is that when you drink coffee, your eyes do change color. You can already see, by the way, that there's nuance to this. Because am I specifying what color it changes to? Does it get darker? Does it get lighter? Does it change to blue, green? Does it just get the darker shade of whatever it is? But let's put that aside for a moment and just say that you will have this null hypothesis and you will have this alternative hypothesis. And to be able to formulate that cleanly, is sort of the first step here. The second thing, of course, is to conduct an experimental design. How are you going to test that hypothesis? As we're going to talk about, a really, really elegant way to test this is using a randomized controlled experiment. If it's possible to blind it, we'll talk about what that means. But and you'll have to decide, well, how long should we make people drink coffee? How frequently should they drink coffee? How are we going to measure eye color? These are the questions that come down to experimental design. You then have to determine a very important variable, which is how many subjects will you have? And of course, that will depend on a number of things, including how many arms you will have in this study. But it comes down to doing something that's called a power analysis. And this is so important that we're going to spend some time talking about it today, although I won't talk about it right now. If this study involves human subjects or animal subjects, you will have to get something called an institutional review board to approve the ethics of the study. So you'll have to get that IRB approval. You'll have to determine what your primary and secondary outcomes are, get the protocol approved, develop a plan for statistics, and then pre-register the study. All of these things happen before you do the study. And of course, in parallel to this, you have to have funding. So those are kind of the steps that go into doing an experimental study. And what we're going to talk about, I think, in a minute is that there are some studies that are not experimental, where some of these steps are obviously skipped.
Yeah, one of the questions we got was, what are the different types of studies out there, and what do they mean? For example, an observational study versus a randomized controlled study. What are the different types of studies?
Yeah, so I think broadly speaking, you can break studies into three categories. One would be observational studies, and we'll bifurcate those or trifurcate those in a minute. Then you can have experimental studies, and then you can have basically summations of and or reviews of and or analyses of studies of any type. So let's kind of start at the bottom of that pyramid. And I think you actually have a figure that I don't like very much, but
I was going to say, I thought it was one of your favorites.
Yeah, I can't stand it. I'll tell you what I like about the figure. I like the color schema, because my boys are so obsessed with rainbows that if I show them this figure, they're going to be really happy. So let's pull up said rainbow figure.
Okay, got it.
Okay, so you can sort of see these buckets here, and again at the level of kind of talking about them, I think this makes sense. What I don't agree with the pyramid for, Bob, is that it puts a hierarchy in place that suggests a meta-analysis is better than a randomized control trial, which is not necessarily true. But let's just kind of go through what each of these things mean. So looking at the observational studies, an individual case report is, I think the first or second paper I ever wrote in my life when I was in medical school was an individual case report. It was a patient who had come into clinic. This was when I was at the NIH. And this was a patient with metastatic melanoma, and their calcium was sky high, dangerously high, in fact. And obviously our first assumption was that this patient had metastatic disease to their bone, and that they were lysing bone, and calcium was leaching into their bloodstream. Turned out that wasn't the case at all. It turned out they had something that had not been previously reported in patients with melanoma, which was they had developed this parathyroid hormone related like hormone in response to their melanoma. So this is a hormone that exists normally, but it doesn't exist in this format. And so their cancer was causing them to have more of this hormone that was causing them to raise their calcium level. It was interesting because it had never been reported before in the literature. And so I wrote this up. This was an individual case report. Is there any value in that? Sure, there's some value in that. The next time a patient with melanoma shows up to clinic and their calcium is sky high and someone goes to the literature to search for it, they'll see that report, and it will hopefully save them time in getting to the diagnosis.
So your mentor and friend, Steve Rosenberg, I think of him when I think of individual case reports, where I think if you listen to the podcast, he talks about this, but a lot of what motivated him early on, I think were just a couple of cases. And I think it gets back to that first question too, about the process for a study to go to an idea to design to execution, which is to have a hypothesis, you need to make an observation. And so you make an observation, you say, that's strange. And I think that's what individual case reports can represent sometimes is this is an interesting observation. It's hypothesis generating for the most part, but it might kickstart a larger trial, or it might kickstart a career. You never know.
Yeah, exactly. Now, of course, it's not going to be generalizable, right? I can't make any statement about, the frequency of this in the broader subset of patients. And obviously, I can't make any comment about any intervention that may or may not change the outcome of this. So that gets us to kind of our next thing, which is like a case series or set of studies. So here you're basically doing the same sort of thing, but in plural, effectively. So you wouldn't just look at one patient. You would say, well, I've now been looking back at my clinical practice, and I've had 27 patients over the last 40 years that have demonstrated this very unusual finding. And another example of this, going back to the Steve Rosenberg case, would be one could write a paper that looks at all spontaneous regressions of cancer. Well, there's obviously been a number of them. They're infrequent. In fact, they're exceedingly rare, but there are certainly enough of them that one could write a case series. So now let's consider cohort studies. So cohort studies are larger studies, and they can be retrospective or they can be prospective. So I'll give you an example of both. So a retrospective observational cohort study would be like, let's go back and look at all the people who have used saunas for the last 10 years and look at how they're doing today relative to people who didn't use saunas over the last 10 years. So it's retrospective. We're looking backwards. It's observational. We're not doing anything, right? We're not telling these people to do this or telling those people to do that. And the hope when you do this is that you're going to see some sort of pattern. Undoubtedly, you will see a pattern. Of course, the question is, will you be able to establish causality in that pattern? Cohort studies can just as easily, although more time-consumingly, be prospective. So you could say, I want to follow people over the next 5 years, 10 years, who use saunas and compare them to a similar number of people who don't. And now, in a forward-looking fashion, we're going to be examining the other behaviors of these people and ultimately what their outcomes are. Do they have different rates of death, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, other metrics of health that we might be interested in? Again, we're not intervening. There's not an experiment per se. We're just observing, but now we're doing it as we march forward through time. Okay. So this brings us to the kind of the next layer of this pyramid, which are the experimental studies. And again, we sort of divide these into randomized versus non-randomized. And of course, this idea of randomization is going to be a very important one as we go through this. So a non-randomized trial sometimes gets referred to as an open label trial, where you take two groups of people and you give one of them a treatment and you give the other one either a placebo or a different treatment, but you don't randomize them. There's a reason that they're in that group. So you might say, we want to study the effect of a certain antibiotic on a person that comes in the ER, and we're going to take all the people that come in who look a certain way. Maybe they have a fever of a certain level or a white blood cell count of a certain level, and we're going to give them the antibiotic. And the people who come in but they don't have those exact signs or symptoms, we're going to not give an antibiotic to, and we're going to follow them. That's kind of a lame example. You could do the same sort of thing with surgical interventions. We're going to try to ask the question, is surgery better than antibiotics for appendicitis or suspected appendicitis, but we don't randomize the people to the choice. There's some other factor that is going to determine whether or not we do that. And as you can see, that's going to have a lot of limitations because presumably there's a reason you're making that decision, and that reason will undoubtedly introduce bias. So of course, the gold standard that we always talk about is a randomized control trial where whatever question you want to study, you study it, but you attempt to take all bias out of it by randomly assigning people into the treatment groups, the 2 or more treatment groups. We'll talk about things like blinding later, because you can obviously get into more and more rigor when you do this. But before we leave the kind of experimental side, anything you want to add to that, Bob?
I would add, so non-randomized controlled trials, maybe another example. I'm trying to think of another example, which is you have patients maybe making a decision beforehand, which we'll get into selection bias, but people might want to go, they might want to go on a statin, let's say, and then you give them a choice, and the other ones might want to go on some other drug like ezetimibe. Mm-hmm. And they're basically selecting themselves into 2 groups, but you could compare those 2 groups and see how they do, but it hasn't been randomized. There's a lot of bias that can go into that. There could be a lot of reasons why one group is selecting a particular treatment over the other. And so that's why I think when we get to randomized trials, that it shows the power of randomization. Yeah,
exactly. We don't need to go back to the figure, but people might recall that at the top of that pyramid was, systemic reviews and meta-analyses. Let's just talk about meta-analyses since they are probably the most powerful. So this is a statistical technique where you can combine data from multiple studies that are attempting to look at the same question, basically. So each study gets a relative weighting, and the weighting of a study is sort of a function of its precision. It depends a little bit on sample size, other events in the study. Larger studies, which have smaller standard errors, are given more weight than smaller studies with larger standard errors, for example. A very common way that these, you'll know you're looking at a meta-analysis. We should have had a figure for this, but I'll describe it the best I can. They usually have a figure somewhere in there that will show kind of across rows all of the studies. So let's say there's 10 studies included in the meta-analysis, and then they'll have the hazard ratios for each of the studies. So they'll represent them usually as little triangles. So the triangle will represent the 95% confidence interval of what the hazard ratio is, which we'll talk about a hazard ratio, but it's basically a marker of the risk. And you'll see all 10 studies, and then they'll show you the final summation of them at the bottom, which of course you wouldn't be able to deduce looking at the figure, but it takes into account that mathematical weighting. So on the surface, meta-analyses seem really, really great, right? Because if one randomized trial is good, 10 must be better. But again, I know I've said this before, probably 3 or 4 times over the past few years on the podcast. But as James Yang, one of the smartest people I ever met when I was both a student and fellow at NCI, once said during a journal club about a meta-analysis that was being presented, he said something to the effect of 1,000 sow's ears makes not a pearl necklace. And that's just an eloquent way to say that garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you do a meta-analysis of a bunch of garbage studies, you get a garbage meta-analysis. So it can't clean garbage. It simply can aggregate it. So a meta-analysis of great randomized control trials will produce a great meta-analysis.
So I'm sure they try to control for garbage, the researchers and the investigators. But I think to your point with the pearl necklace, imagine if you had, say, 10 trials and 9 of them are garbage. One of them is really good, really rigorous randomized controlled trial. And you're looking at the top of the pyramid and you're saying, well, meta-analysis is the best. We should be looking at this meta-analysis. Meanwhile, you've got that one randomized controlled trial that actually is worth its salt. It's rigorous, et cetera. That I would say, if you had the option, I think you probably would rely more on that one randomized controlled trial, which is lower on the pyramid. So I think that's probably I think you've told me one of your hangups with the pyramid, because it's not necessarily top of the pyramid. It's going to be some meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials.
That's right. Yeah, and so I don't want to suggest meta-analyses are not great. What I want to suggest is you can't just take a meta-analysis as gospel without actually looking at each study. You don't get a pass at examining each of the constitutive studies within a meta-analysis is really the point I think we want to make here.
Yeah. There's one thing in here that isn't represented, but we had a few questions about it. I think a couple. People were asking about, you know, what's the difference between a phase 3 and a phase 2 or a phase 1 clinical trial? Do you know what's going on there?
Yes, and these are great questions. So here we're talking about human clinical trials, and this phraseology is used by the FDA here in the United States, and typically the world does tend to follow in lockstep, but not always with kind of the FDA's process. So if you go way back, you have an interesting idea. You have a drug that you think is, or a molecule that you think will have some, benefit. Let's think of it as a cancer therapeutic. And you've done some interesting experiments in animals, and you maybe started with some mice and you went up to some rats, and maybe even you've done something in primates. And now you're really sort of committed to this as the success of this and the safety of this in animals looks good. So it's both safe and efficacious in animals. And you now decide you want to foray into the human space. Well, the first thing you have to do is file for something called an IND, an investigational new drug application. So after you do all of this preclinical work, you have to file this IND with the FDA. And that basically sets your intention of testing this as a drug in humans. And the first phase of that, which is called phase 1, is geared specifically to dose escalate this drug from a very, very low level to determine what the toxicity is across a range of doses that will hopefully have efficacy. So these are typically very small studies, usually less than 100 people. And they're typically done in cohorts. So you might say, well, the first 12 people are going to be at 0.1 milligrams per kilogram. And assuming we see no adverse effects there, we'll go up to 0.15 milligrams per kilogram for the next 12 people. And if we have no issues there, we'll escalate it to 0.25. Now, you'll notice, Bob, I said nothing in there about does the drug work, right? So
right.
These are going to be patients with cancer. If this is a drug that's being sought as a treatment for colon cancer, these are going to be patients that all have colon cancer. They're often going to be patients who have metastatic colon cancer, right? So these are going to be patients who have progressed through all other standard treatments and who are basically saying, look, sign me up for this clinical trial. I realize that this first phase is not going to be necessarily giving me a high enough dose that I could experience a benefit, and that you're really only looking to make sure that this drug doesn't hurt me, but nevertheless, I want to participate in this trial. So if the drug gets through phase 1 safely, then it goes to phase 2. And the goal of phase 2 is to continue to evaluate for safety, but also to start to look for efficacy. But this is done in an open label fashion. What that means is they're not randomizing patients to one drug versus the other typically. They can, but usually it's now we think we know 1 or 2 doses that are going to produce efficacy. They were deemed safe in the phase 1. We're now going to take patients and give them this drug and look for an effect. And a lot of times, if there's no control arm in the study, you're going to compare to the natural history. So let's assume that we know that patients with metastatic colon cancer have, on standard of care, have a median survival of X months. Well, we're going to give these patients this drug and see if that extends it anymore. And of course, you could do this with a control arm, but now it adds the number of patients to the study. So again, typically very small studies can be, in the 20, 30, 40, 50 range, maybe up to a few hundred people.
And that one, Peter, I think is probably a good example of if you have the non-randomization, this might be a case where, say it's an immunotherapy and people know about the immunotherapy and it's been really effective for a particular, it's approved for a particular cancer, let's say. And there are a lot of people that know about it. And there are cancer patients that know about it and they want to get that treatment, but it's not approved. If they're talking to their doctor, or maybe they're online, they might enroll in one of these trials because they really want to try the drug, and maybe they might believe in it more than some other treatment.
Yep. Yeah, there are lots of things that can introduce bias to a phase 2 if it does not have randomization. Again, the goal would be to still randomize in phase 2 because you really do want to tease out efficacy. So if a study, if a compound succeeds in phase 2, which means it continues to show no significant adverse safety effects, which, by the way, doesn't mean it doesn't have side effects, right? Every treatment has side effects. It's just that it doesn't have side effects that are deemed unacceptable for the risk profile of the patient. And it shows efficacy. So really, you have to have these two things. You then proceed to phase 3. And here, a phase 3 is a really rigorous trial. This is a huge step up. It's typically a log step up in the number of patients. So you're talking potentially thousands of patients here. And this is absolutely a placebo-controlled trial, or not necessarily placebo, but it can be sort of standard of care versus standard of care plus this new agent. But it is randomized. Whenever possible, it is blinded. And with drugs, that's always possible. And these are typically longer studies. So now, because you have so much more sample size, you're going to potentially pick up side effects that weren't there in the first place. And of course, now you really have that gold standard for measuring efficacy. And it's on the basis of the phase 1, phase 2, and mostly phase 3 data that a drug will get approved or not approved for broad use, which leads to a fourth phase, which is a post-marketing study. So phase 4 studies take place after the drug has been approved, and they're used to basically get additional information because once a drug is approved, you now have more people taking it. And they may also be using this to look at other indications for the drug. So we talked about this recently, right? A phase 4 trial with semaglutide being used to look at obesity versus its original phase 3 trials, which were looking at diabetes. So kind of the drug's already been approved. This study isn't being done to ask the question, should semaglutide be on the market? No, it's on the market. It's basically expanding the indication for semaglutide, in this case, so that insurance companies would actually pay for it for a new indication. But given the size and the number of these studies, you're also looking for, hey, is there another side effect here that we missed in the phase 3?
Right. And it might be the particular population that might have a different risk profile, so that you might have a different threshold.
That's right, because you're not doing this in patients with type 2 diabetes. You're doing this in patients who explicitly don't have diabetes but have obesity. Different patients. Are we going to see something different here? So yeah. So anyway, that's the long and short of phases 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Okay. So going back to observational studies, are there any things that you look for in particular that will increase or decrease your confidence in it, whether it's a pearl necklace or garbage?
Yeah, I mean, and you've already kind of touched on this, but I think that selection bias is a big one. So I think when I think about observational studies, whether they be prospective or retrospective, the healthy user bias, I think, is one of the more common ones we see in the epidemiology as it pertains to health. So I wouldn't even know where to begin talking about these studies because the examples are so myriad. But, is bacon bad for you? Well, if you look at observational epidemiology, bacon is almost always bad for you. I don't know what the hazard ratios are, Bob, but it's probably in the neighborhood of 1.3 or something like that, meaning it has about a 30% increase in the risk of basically anything you look at, right? Whether it be cancer, heart disease, death. Is that directionally right?
I think that's right. I mean, there's probably more nuance because it's the WHO is looking at, I think they said over 700 epidemiological studies for red meat consumption, and I think they also had processed meat consumption.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at those, we can get into it, but how are they measuring bacon consumption? They're using these food frequency questionnaires. Probably get into this recall bias, but yeah, generally, I think with the WHO stuff, I think it was about 20 to 30% associated increase.
Yeah. And so you look at that on the surface, of course you'd be concerned. You'd be like, oh my God, like I shouldn't be eating fill in the blank. I shouldn't be drinking coffee. I shouldn't be eating bacon. I shouldn't be eating meat at all. The problem with these studies is that you can't ever, no matter how much you try to statistically reconcile it, you can't strip out the fact that people make choices not in isolation. So is there any difference between a person who makes a lifelong decision to not eat meat and a person who doesn't? Of course there is. And it's going to come down to many things that go beyond their diet, including things that can't be controlled for. Now, obviously you can control for some things. Smoking. A person who doesn't eat meat is far less likely to smoke than a person who does. A person who doesn't eat meat is probably far more likely to exercise or pay attention to their sleep habits or be more compliant with their medications or things like that. Again, not that people who don't eat meat don't care about those things, but people who don't eat meat, not that people who eat meat don't care about those things. People who don't eat meat, basically that is a proxy. That is a really good marker for someone who is very, very health conscious. So this healthy user bias permeates everywhere. And by the way, it permeates in both directions. So if you look at the epidemiology that started to become very popular about 10 years ago, that was suggesting that diet soda was more fattening than soda, right? So drinking a Diet Coke is worse than drinking a Coke. Well, on the surface, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, right? I mean, Diet Coke has no calories in it. Coke is full of just liquid sugar. And of course, that gets you thinking, is it the aspartame or whatever else? Well, I mean, a far simpler explanation is look at people who are drinking diet soda versus people who are drinking soda. You could make an argument, and I think this is the argument, that as a person is becoming more metabolically ill and they're being informed that they really need to stop drinking soda, they're going to be drinking diet soda. And so it's very difficult to look at just people drink this, people drink that. They're otherwise identical, and simply the only difference between them is what they drink. It just doesn't really hold up. So anyway, you're always going to look for that sort of healthy user bias. You talked about another bias a second ago, which is informational recall bias. And I think many people are just shocked to learn how clunky and kludgy nutritional epidemiology is. I mean, it's like when you think about all of the amazing technology we have in the world, and you look at, we just recently did a podcast and talking about some of the most cutting edge tools of neuroscience that allow you to examine the behavior of a single neuron using channel opsins and all these things. Like, that's at one end of science, and at the other end of science we have this thing called a food frequency questionnaire, where you get a call from Billy, and he asks you, hey, do you remember how many times a week you ate oatmeal for the past year? I mean, I pay quite a bit of attention to what I eat. I don't know how I'd answer that question.
You just go to your spreadsheet of your oatmeal consumption, right?
Yeah. Now, you've dug into this a bit, Bob. Can you, I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek and facetious. Can you try to make the case that recall bias isn't really that bad and I'm just exaggerating?
I can't make that case. I guess it might depend on, what are you recalling?
Okay, what's
so are
the
you
best,
recalling
what's
your
the
smoking
best
history,
case?
let's
Yeah,
say,
what's the best
compared
case
to food?
scenario?
Best case scenario. Well, maybe so. I would probably get out of the food category. It might have to do with something, say, like smoking history. And you might even have receipts of the last time that you paid for cigarettes or something like that. That if you ask people how much did you smoke in the last year, I think you can get a more accurate answer. But with the food frequency questionnaires, there's so many analyses, but even just the number of foods that are out there compared to the number of foods that are encapsulated in the food frequency questionnaire, vastly different. It only covers a very small portion of it. But And it's actually the foods that I think the epidemiologists often look at, like the red meat consumption and things like that, that people will vastly they will underestimate. It's when they do like these validity studies and actually follow them, or they do like a food log compared to the food frequency questionnaires. It's the correlation is so low that it's so underestimated that you're not really getting an accurate picture. So I don't know about like a best case scenario with food frequency questionnaires for food. I guess it would be on frequency. Imagine if you got a food frequency questionnaire that was maybe more technologically advanced, where you got like it's an app where you literally recall at the end of each day, what did I eat today? Or even after each meal. But the problem is, I think, is the frequency of this, that oftentimes you're doing one questionnaire for what did you eat over the course of, say, 1 year or 2 years, or even they'll just do one food frequency questionnaire at the beginning of the study at baseline. They'll follow up with these people for say 10 years, 20 years. And the assumption is they don't change their eating habits. They never ask them again, what happened here. But if they look at, they might compare two groups. One group has higher bacon consumption than the other. The assumption is that they're going to continue with those dietary habits for, in perpetuity. So again, that's not a best case scenario. But I guess the best case scenario is that you could have more rigor, I think, if you did it more frequently, because obviously I think, if I asked you what you had for breakfast this morning, I think you probably have more confidence in the answer than what did you have for breakfast on January 3rd of last year.
Yeah, I mean, I think with nutrition, because I spend so much time doing this type of stuff with patients, it's metaphysically impossible. And I really feel strongly that we should abandon food frequency questionnaires, and no study should ever be published that includes them. I'm going to anger a number of epidemiologists listening to this, but I really think we need to put a stop to that. I think where recall is reasonable is, as you said, on things that are more profound. I mean, if we wanted to do a study on think of something really that you would never forget, like, childbirth, like asking women to recall, how many times have you been pregnant? How many times did you either have an abortion or miscarry? And how many times did you deliver at term? Like something that profound. Yeah, I would feel confident that if you asked a woman that question over the past 10 years of her life, you would get very accurate answers. But by the way, it still doesn't tell me that I would be able to infer causality. If I was trying to look at women who have, never had a miscarriage versus women who have had miscarriages, just because I look back and ask them to tell me those things doesn't mean that embedded within those differences are other biological or social or economic factors. So you kind of get where we're going here, which is, I think epidemiology has a place, but I think it's the pendulum has sort of swung a little too far, and its place has been asserted as being more valuable than I think it probably is. You kind of talked about something that's, I think, a very important bias that exists in any study, but I think this is actually a big problem in experimental studies, in prospective studies if they're done incorrectly, which is something called performance bias. So the Hawthorne effect is basically an effect that says if a person is watching you, you will change your behavior. So anybody who has tried to fastidiously log what they eat every day, which I've done, many people have done this, there's no question you change your behavior. Just by logging what you eat, you will change what you eat. How much more will you do it when you know someone is going to look at it? Unbelievably so. In fact, you could make a case that one of the most efficacious dietary interventions known to man is having somebody watch what you eat every meal. Not just every meal, every moment. And whether you have somebody virtually or literally watching you at every moment eat, especially someone who, you're not entirely comfortable with, that's going to have an enormous impact. I think isn't there a name for this that's like is it the Hertz effect?
Yes, it's the Avis effect, because actually I think Hertz might, in the 70s and 80s, Avis was always behind.
Oh, they were behind
Was it
Hertz.
budget?
Yeah,
It was either Hertz or budget rent-a-car. So their slogan, I thought it was a great, kind of cool, interesting. Basically, we're number two, and then they would say we try harder because we've got this inferiority complex. We're number two, and that trying to think of an example because that the Hawthorne effect is it's almost like a experimenter bias that the experimenter is observing the people under the lamp. That was the where this came from. And looked at work productivity with different lighting. And they got the clipboard, and it could be your boss that's out there and looking and watching you. And so that experimenter is having the effect with the Avis effect. I think it's more trying to think of an example. So say you, Peter, competitive Peter, were enrolled in a cycling trial, and you realize say it's open label, and you get a placebo or you get nothing. And you know that there's another group out there that say, I think we looked at this a little bit, say it's like this lotion that you put on and supposedly it's supposed to improve your performance. There could be a part of you that says I'm going to beat those guys. The control group, they're going to say we're number two, we're not getting the special treatment. So we're going to win this thing. It sounds like that wouldn't happen, but I think that people, if they enroll in a trial, sometimes there's that competitive nature. And it's also to your point about if you have somebody watching you, that could also adjust your performance. Now you have this, whether it's not physically somebody watching you, but that there's a trial that's following you, and that that they're going to be looking, a year down the road, 2 years down the road, or even 3 weeks down the road is probably more common, and they're gonna test you again and see how you do and see if you improve or see if you don't. Those things can play a role. And just to the point of somebody that might be not pleasant that's watching you as far as food, there's a great Saturday Night Live clip with it's The Rock in the clip, and it's a commercial for it's called Nicotrel, and it's a smoking cessation treatment, and it's actually The Rock is named Nick Cottrell, and there's a guy on a couch and he's about to smoke a cigarette, and The Rock comes out jacked, smacks a cigarette out of his hand, and it's one of the most effective smoking cessation programs I've seen.
I bet. I think there's a more sinister form of performance bias that creeps up in clinical trials, especially in randomized controlled trials where you think at the surface, wow, this is a really well done study. So you'll take two groups and let's say it's a weight loss trial, and we're going to test calorie restriction versus pick your diet, your favorite, the all potato diet. So the calorie restricted group is given some leaflets, and it tells them how to measure calories and that they need to cut their calories by 25% from baseline, and we'll see you in 12 weeks. The potato diet group is given twice weekly counseling sessions on all the different ways you can cook potatoes so that you don't get, fed up and bored of eating potatoes all day on the potato diet group. And at the end of the study, the potato diet group lost more weight than the calorie restricted group. Well, it'd be tempting to say, well, come on, this was a randomized control trial. I mean, but the problem is there's an enormous performance bias in the potato group in that they were given far more attention. They were observed more. They were given more coaching. They had much more of a positive behavioral influence. And I would say that's the number one bias that I see in RCTs that are lifestyle-based is that very sort of subtle performance bias. So if you're really designing a trial well, you have to flatten the curve on those differences. So each person in each group should be getting the exact same amount of attention, the exact same amount of touch with the investigators, the exact same type of advice, so that you can sort of eliminate that difference, which unfortunately shows up a lot.
Yeah, I think that almost gets back to this idea of the null hypothesis that what'd you say, coffee might darken your eyes, and that's your guess. Maybe you've observed it. You've got a couple of case studies of some people in your family or whatever, and so that's your hypothesis. And then the way that you design the trial is interesting because it's really like this coffee is going to be innocent until proven guilty. That's going to be the default position. And then it's really your role. And it seems almost counterintuitive to a lot of people. And it's hard actually from a human perspective, is that your role is really to be as rigorous as possible to essentially, falsify your hypothesis. You need to do that, as rigorously as you can. And sometimes, I think to your point, sometimes it's like you get really excited about a treatment. The people that are involved in the study, the investigators, they're really excited about it. And the control group or the placebo, it's almost an afterthought. And so there might be a lot of things that they're doing in the treatment group, not just the treatment itself, that could bias the study.
Yeah. So kind of continuing on that thread of other things that you want to look at in a study is, and we talked about this very briefly in passing, was the idea of differentiating primary from secondary outcomes. So, and there's some debate about whether you can only have one primary outcome or whether you can have co-primary outcomes. But the primary outcomes are basically the outcomes for which the study is designed around and powered against. Again, we will come to this idea of power in a moment. But there are lots of secondary outcomes, and they're often exploratory. So it's really important that when people are pre-registering studies, they state what the primary outcome is and what the secondary outcomes are. And typically, a study that fails to meet its primary outcome will be deemed a null study, even if it meets secondary outcomes. So it's just very important to pay attention to the subtlety of that. And again, a good journal with a pre-registered study is going to make that abundantly clear. But I can promise you that someone writing about it in the newspaper is virtually never going to make that distinction. And it's important to understand that, because it gets to this next issue, which is kind of the multiple hypothesis testing problem. So, research should be hypothesis seeking or hypothesis testing, but it can also be hypothesis generating. And so you can use statistical tools to slice and dice data in multiple ways, and you can take many looks at data to see if you actually find something significant there. You have to be careful, because the more you look, the more times you look at something, the more likely you are to find something that is indeed positive. So, this isn't a great analogy, but just to kind of give you a sense of it, if you flip a coin and it's a fair coin, you've got like a 50% chance of getting heads. If you get two chances to flip the coin, the probability that you're going to get heads is now 75%. If you get three chances to flip a coin, you're up to 87.5% chance that you're going to get at least one head. If you flip this thing 10 times, you're basically at 100% likely that you're going to get heads. So if you're allowed 10 looks, you have to correct for that. And there's something in statistics called a Bonferroni correction factor that does force you to do that. It forces you to divide your p-value by n, where n is the number of times you've taken a look at the data, so to speak. And therefore, it raises the bar for what is significant. And again, we'll talk about p-values for folks who maybe aren't as familiar with that in a second. Anything else? I'm kind of rattling off a long list of things that are one would look for. Is there anything else that you'd add to that? I'm sure I'm missing some things.
Well, I think it's maybe a more technical term that we didn't bring up, which is confounding. But that when we talked about the healthy user bias, I think that's a great example of something that can confound your results. That doesn't necessarily, it's not in the causal pathway, let's call it, that might be affecting the results, whether it's age, sex, smoking. The list is almost endless, and this is what those observational studies will try to control for, in order to almost mimic what randomization would look like.
Right. This is the sort of the bane of the existence of the epidemiologist, right? So if you're trying to determine a relationship between hot chocolate consumption and skiing accidents, it's very likely that people who drink more hot chocolate are more likely to have ski accidents. So does skiing cause hot chocolate consumption, or do ski accidents cause hot chocolate consumption? Does consuming hot chocolate make you a worse skier? Or is it that people who live in colder climates consume more hot chocolate, and usually skiing occurs in colder climates outside of Dubai? So climate, therefore, is obviously a confounder, and the goal is to be able to identify every possible confounder when you're doing epidemiology. And I think, as John Ioannidis argued, when we had him on our podcast, and that would be a good podcast for people to go back and listen to alongside this. It's really not possible to identify, let alone eliminate, all confounders.
Absolutely. So if we look at experiments or experimental studies compared to observational studies, are there things you look for specifically or in particular for experimental studies to increase or decrease your confidence in them?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, randomization, right? So if an experiment isn't randomized, again, it doesn't mean that it's useless, but it just means it's going to be a lot harder to really make sense of this. And randomization needs to be a rigorous randomization. You can randomize incorrectly, believe it or not. I think there's a very famous example with Predimed, which was a study that when it was published was kind of a remarkable finding, a very large study, something like 7,500 people randomized into 3 groups, 2,500 per group, given basically 2 different dietary patterns, a Mediterranean diet in 2 versions and a low-fat diet. This was a primary prevention study, so it was looking at people who are high risk, but who haven't had heart attacks or anything yet, and it was looking at mortality. And the study was actually stopped early, again, something we're going to talk about in a second, because it had such a positive effect. So the Mediterranean diet had such a favorable effect relative to the low-fat diet that people were dying at a rate far less, such that it would have been unethical to continue the study for the 7.5 years it was planned to run. And I think they stopped it in the 4-year mark and sort of declared victory. But then something happened, Bob. What happened?
Actually, so they went back and reanalyzed this Predimed group. The first paper was published in New England Journal of Medicine 2013, and they had basically a correction, but they almost like a brand new article addressing some issues. So they did a reanalysis that was published in 2018. I think it came from this fellow named John Carlisle, who had this way of looking, and I think this was we've got a email on this with David Allison, who's a great statistician. He talks about this in his article too, as well, where he looked at this. But this fellow named John Carlisle did this analysis where he looked at thousands of studies, and he could flag the studies and see, does this truly look like randomization based on some particular statistics? And the Predimed study was flagged, looking like this doesn't look like proper randomization. There might be something going on here. And I think according to the media outlets, I think I read in the New York Times, they talked to the lead or the senior investigator, and he said that it turns out that some of the villages or the clinics, I forget how many clinics in total there were in the study, but at 11 of the clinics, one of the investigators were randomizing the entire clinics to one group. And this is what I think is really interesting about just looking at, like, if you really want to dig into a study, sometimes you really have to get the story, which is in why you think it. I think oftentimes you look at randomization, oh, that's really simple. You just randomize people to different groups, and blinded or unblinded. It's very hard to blind the fact that you see your neighbor get a delivery every week of a jug of olive oil or a sack of mixed nuts, which were the 2 Mediterranean groups. And I think what happened was people started complaining in the villages. They're like, "What do I get?" And they're like, "You got your low-fat diet pamphlet. Remember? Like, we give it to you every year." So that happened in that study, and that's typically referred to as so you can do that in a study, and that's typically referred to as a cluster randomization, where you might randomize one classroom to another classroom, which might be convenient, but it requires different statistical methods. So that was one of the things that happened there. And then they also, another way.
Let's use that example, because that's actually a really good one, right? If you want to study the effects of meditation on, attention span of kids, it's very different to say, we're going to just take 100 kids and randomize 50 into one group, 50 into another, and separate them, versus saying, we've got a class, 2 classes over here, 2 classes over here. We're going to split those 2 and 2 into the effect. That's a totally different type of randomization. One is a true randomization, one's a cluster randomization. And while you can do the latter, it requires a different statistical adjustment. So yeah, I think Predimed basically had to reanalyze all of their data. In light of that, it it turned out in the case of Predimed, the results still held, but it will always kind of be a cloud that hangs over it.
Yeah, and I think Ioannidis, to just to make his point, when he found it, I think he was a huge fan of the Predimed study, and something that he said, which I think might be intuitive, is he said if they're randomizing entire villages, to a group, and they're not accounting for it, he thinks I'm not sure that's going to be the only problem in that study, and that everything was uncovered. But on the flip side, it's really, really hard to do everything right in a study. You're going to make mistakes.
Yeah, and now imagine randomizing a household where you say, okay, Dad, you're on a Mediterranean diet for the next 7 years. Mom, you're on a low-fat diet for the next 7 years. I mean, it starts to get very difficult. Okay, so again, that's one important thing. You also want to make sure, is there a control group? Not all randomization, not all prospective trials have control groups. Sometimes it's a single group where a person serves as their own control, and there's typically a crossover. So you'll take a group, you'll randomize them into two, but there's it's not that one group is getting treatment A and the other group is getting placebo or treatment B. It's both groups get both treatments plus or minus a placebo in different orders. And this is a great statistical tool, provided the treatment doesn't interfere with the washout, or the sort of the treatment doesn't interfere with the control session. The reason this is powerful is you need far fewer subjects when everybody gets to serve as their own control. So it greatly reduces basically the cost and logistics of a study. But you run into challenges, right? So if you take 20 people are going to take this drug that is supposed to, help them exercise better for 8 weeks, and another group is going to take a placebo for 8 weeks and exercise, and then everybody switches, because that's the right way you would do it. You had some people start first on the treatment, some people start first on the placebo. You have to figure out, do you need a gap between the treatments? Because will the effects of that drug linger into the placebo period for one group, which is not what's happening to the other group? And even if it is, even if you're only doing it with one group, are you confounding the effect of that treatment? I hope that makes sense, Bob. I don't know if I'm making sense. I know you know what I'm saying, but is there a better way to explain that?
I think that makes sense. One other point I was going to make about that too, with the crossover groups, I was going to ask you about that, because I've seen the statistical power, I guess you would call it, of the crossover groups, is you can see relatively small studies, not a lot of people, pretty short, and you look at the p-values, and we'll get into that, but they're 0.000 something. And I guess the assumption when I was thinking about it, when you're talking about it, and they serve as their own controls, it's almost as if they're treating them like if you could get identical twins and randomize those identical twins to one group or the other, you would think that's great, because you're controlling for so many things about the physiology or the genotype, et cetera, about those people. And it's almost like they treat these crossover groups as that you're almost cloning these people. You're comparing them to themselves. But I think it's a good point. And there might be something about the order of the treatments that they receive. If they get treatment A and then treatment B, maybe one might have an effect on the other. And
the really good ones go A, B, and then BA. They divide them into two groups and go A, B, and BA. And yeah, it really comes down to the fact that you can use what's called a paired t-test. And the simplicity of the statistic of the paired t-test is part of its elegance here, and that it basically eliminates a lot of variance. Okay, so then we talked earlier about this blinding. What does that mean? So in an ideal world, both the subjects and the investigators should not know who is getting the treatment and who is getting the placebo. At a minimum, the subjects should not know. That would be single blinding. But again, double blinding is always preferred if possible, because the investigators can be biased. They can have hidden biases if they know the outcome. So for example, if patients are being given a drug for weight loss, you could say, well, it's pretty easy to blind the patients from that. But if the investigators know that, they might behave differently towards the patients for whom they expect greater weight loss if they believe that this drug is effective. So again, very important and sometimes very challenging. I think we talked about this in the podcast with Rick Doblin. One of the huge challenges of studying psychedelics is it's very difficult to blind anybody. Most of all, the user, right? The subject. When one group is getting psilocybin and the other group is getting, even if it's niacin, which causes some flushing, it's not hard to know which group you're in, and that may affect the results. Size matters, duration matters, and basically the generalizability of the study. So, is it in a population that replicates or looks like what I'm interested in studying, whether it's me or my patient or whomever I care about? And there are strengths and weaknesses to mass heterogeneity of studies. So the more heterogeneous a study in terms of its patient population, well, the more generalizable the results are, but the higher the bar for finding it. So one of the big I think this has got a lot of attention lately, but I think for a while it was a relatively unknown kind of dirty little secret of medicine, was how many clinical trials involved men only, and how many drugs were approved for both men and women, but on the basis of only being studied in men. And the rationale for this was that it was more complicated to study women, right? So women, especially premenopausal women, because they have a menstrual cycle, that really changes things hormonally, and therefore, it's more complicated to do studies and look at drug kinetics and all sorts of things in women. And so the easier way to do that was to just study it in a homogeneous population of men. Well, of course, that poses an enormous problem if you're now trying to extrapolate the utility of that drug in women. So it's an extreme example, but a very important one. For large studies, you tend to want to know, is this a multi-site or a single site? Again, Predimed's a great example, right? So you had a multi-site study, and there were probably significant differences between how the sites were run. So there's an advantage to multi-sites because in theory, it brings more heterogeneity. It should cancel out the effect of any one study over another, but it's harder to control. And therefore, you can have, whether it be deliberately or non-deliberately, rogue studies or sites rather, introducing more bias. I think another thing I really look at here is how big is the association of the effect? And we'll talk about this with power, but you can have something that is statistically significant. So in that sense, the study is quote unquote a success, but it's clinically irrelevant. The effect is not that big. So we've tested this new drug for blood pressure, and it lowers systolic blood pressure by 1 millimeter of mercury after a year of use. And it's like, okay, that might be statistically significant if the study was large enough. Is it clinically significant? Almost assuredly not. You want to pay attention to what the adverse events were, both in frequency, severity, and distribution. You want to pay very close attention to who funded the trial. Trials don't fund themselves, and a lot of trials are funded by drug companies. Now, again, they're usually done with very clear data monitoring and data analytics, and despite all of the sort of fear-mongering out there, it's not like pharma really gets to put their hand on the scale of these pharma studies. But where I think things can get a little dicey is in terms of things getting buried in supplemental journals and things like that. So you do want to pay a bit of attention to who's funding a trial. And I think even more important than that is kind of understanding what the conflicts of interest are of the authors. And nowadays those have to be declared, but there's been a huge amount of hoopla over that. And there have been some very famous examples of people who are on editorial boards of journals or publishing like crazy and not declaring that, hey, I'm a paid consultant of these 10 pharma companies and I'm writing or doing experiments on drugs by these people, or I'm an editor on journals that are commenting on this. And then finally, you really want to understand if the study was adequately powered. And this becomes very important if the study has a null outcome. So you want to just spend a minute and we'll talk about power?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
So power is defined as 1 minus beta, where beta is defined as the probability of a false negative. Now, let's contrast that for a moment by talking about what a false positive is. A false positive is defined as alpha, and that's also known as the p-value. Okay, so let me kind of restate this. A p-value is basically trying to answer the question, what's the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis when it is in fact true? So if the p-value is 0, it means it's impossible. And if it's 1, it means you are absolutely going to do it. So obviously we want p-values that are as small as possible. It can never be 0, but you want them to be as close to 0 as possible. And basically we say 5% is our minimum threshold, or really our maximum threshold. That's the ceiling that we'll put on this idea. So you go back to what we talked about at the outset. So the default position is that the null hypothesis is correct, that there is no difference between the groups. So this term statistical significance basically means that the null hypothesis is rejected if the p-value is less than that pre-stated level. I don't know if I'm explaining this really, really well, Bob. Is there anything you would add to this? Because I think this is an important idea, even though its p-values are so ubiquitous. But I think it's maybe worth spending one more minute on it before we go back to power.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it sounds like it makes sense. I'm trying to think of somebody who might not understand it as well. But I think that those examples that you gave are good. And this is, so you see on most papers, I think you'll see this p-value of 0.05. And we can get into the confidence intervals, but you'll see 95% confidence interval and p-value of 0.05. And like you said, that's your false positive rate. So I guess maybe imagine, and it's an arbitrary threshold. So you could try to submit a paper, and I've seen sometimes I usually catch it by the confidence interval. I'll see 90% confidence interval on some table, or some figure or table, and I'll look at it, and they'll use a p-value of less than 0.1 and maybe they have some justification for it or not, but it really is this arbitrary threshold. So I think, like, imagine if your p-value was if it's less than 0.95, we're gonna reject the null hypothesis. So you could have in theory, if this thing, if the it's not exact, but if it's the chance of this being a false positive is about 90% based on your analysis, that's still you would reject the null hypothesis that there's no difference between these groups, which sounds sort of insane. So it's kind of this, I don't know, I think it was this guy Fisher who maybe established this 0.05, but this has been the threshold that they're more or less they're willing to accept, at least for the purposes of a single trial, that the p-value of 0.05, that they're willing to accept a level of false positive in their results and still make that claim that they rejected that hypothesis.
Right, because if you make the p-value so low, if you say, no, my threshold is 0.00000001, well, then you really run the risk of discarding a lot of information that turns out to be kind of relevant. So, it is a fine balance between those two. So now
that would be a false negative, right? So if
exactly
the lower there, yeah. So there might be an effect, but you're not going to see it.
So this false negative rate, we typically allow to be a larger number. It's typically between 10 and 20%, and what that means is the flip side of that is we have 80 to 90% power, because 1 minus that accepted false negative rate is called your power. And I think this is one of the most important concepts to understand in designing any sort of clinical trial, whether it's humans, animals, any sort of intervention. So there's a table, they're all over the place, but this is the one I've always liked. It's old. It's probably 10 years old, probably longer than that actually, but it's out of an old great textbook, cancer textbook on clinical trials. So pull up this table, Bob, and we'll kind of walk through.
Okay, got it. Power table.
Okay. All right, these look a little intimidating at the outset, so let's kind of walk through how to interpret this. So what this table is saying is you want to presuppose what the difference is between the treatment groups. you have to say, I believe that the difference between the success rate in the treatment between group A and group B is going to be X percent. And the smaller of the two is Y percent. So let's come up with a real number. So I think that we are going to look at how this drug, impacts your rate of surviving a urinary tract infection or being, cured of this infection. And I think that the placebo group is going to have a success rate of 25%. And I think that the treatment group is going to have a success of 35%. So I think there's a 10% gap, and I think the lower of those two is 25%. So you go to 0.25 on the horizontal axis, and you go to 0.1 over on the column, and you'll see there's two numbers there, 459 and 358. And the upper of those two is if you want 90% power, i.e. 10% false negative, and the lower of those two is for 80% power or 20% false negative rate. And those numbers basically tell you how many people you need in each of the two treatment groups if you want to be significant at a level of 0.05%. So what do you notice when you look at this? You notice that the bigger the gap, the bigger the effect size between the two groups, the fewer subjects you need. So if you march from left to right in this table, holding that effect size at 0.25, if you say, well, the difference is 15%, it goes to you only need 216 or 165. If the difference is 30%, so one group is going to have a 25% success rate, one group's going to have a 55% success rate, you're down to 60 and 47. And if you go out to a 50% difference, so one group is going to have a 25% response rate, the other group's a 75% response rate, you're now down to needing somewhere between 18 and 23 people per arm. And by the way, if you go down to 5%, one group responds at 25%, the other at 30%, you're at 1,700 or nearly 1,300, depending on your level of power. So I appreciate everybody kind of bearing with me as I went through this power table. It seems like one of the driest things in the world, but as my mentor once told me, it's the single most important table you should ever familiarize yourself with if you want to be in the business of designing clinical trials, or basically any sort of experiment, because it is just so easy to get this wrong and over or underpower an experiment. So what does that mean? So to underpower experiment, I think, is the more common mistake here. So you simply don't have enough people in the study to appreciate a difference if it is there. And so the study ends up being null. The p-value does not exceed the threshold of 0.05. And you say, look, there is no difference between treatment A and treatment B, when in reality, there may well have been, but you didn't have the power to determine it, and therefore you don't actually know if you should have rejected the null hypothesis or accepted it. I think that makes sense, right, Bob? Does that?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the other problem, equally sinister, perhaps not as common, is when a study is overpowered. And now you have more people in the study than you should have had for the effect size, and you start to find things that are statistically significant, but are probably irrelevant clinically. So that's when you start to pick up an effect size of 1% when you're dealing with something clinically that should never be thought of as being relevant below 10% detection threshold. So notwithstanding the fact that you also probably, had more people in a study than you needed to, it could have cost more. And you typically don't see this as much with clinical trials, but you'll see this more with kind of data dump trials. So sort of data mining studies where they're, grossly overpowered. Okay, I kind of got way off on a tangent there. I don't know why I went down that path of power, but I know it's important.
So I think we got on the subject because we were looking at things you look for in an experimental study that increase or decrease your confidence in it. And I think it's something that's, if people have this list, it's often left off. I think it's important.
Yep. Okay, good. So power matters. And when you look at a study and it's not significant, you should ask the question, was this study powered correctly? And I mean, I can't tell just by looking. I actually have to pull out that table we just went over and go through the matrix and go, okay, well, this is how many people were in it. Therefore, at 80% power, they were detected to tell a difference between the two groups of this much with an effect size here. And then a lot of times like, oh, wow, this study wasn't powered appropriately anyway. So I've learned nothing new here, unfortunately.
Is it true that you have a laminate of this in your wallet, this power table?
I don't anymore, but I used to have a laminated copy at my desk, yes. I made placemats out of it for the kids. They love it.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Oh, hours of enjoyment. So related to this, I think you probably, without looking at their power analysis, which often, I think this is like maybe a tip, is often you won't see anything in their paper, but you might see it in the protocol if they include that, where they'll talk about how they powered the study, what was their justification, what was the effect size that they were looking for, and how many participants did they need, and then you can look at how many they actually got in the trial that actually completed the trial or enrolled in the trial. And to your point of overpowering a study, sometimes you might be able to discern it if you're looking at that example, or I think you said there's a drug that lowers systolic blood pressure by 1 millimeters of mercury, and the results are statistically significant. I think that might put up your feelers and say, how many thousands of patients were in this study, and I think that gets to another question, which is looking at how these differences are actually determined, whether when you're looking at the effect in one group versus the effect in another group. So what are some of the ways in which researchers measure the association or the quote unquote effect size in these studies?
Well, a lot of times it's only reported as a relative risk, but I think you and I have harped on this in the past, which is you can't really talk about relative risk without knowing absolute risk. And sometimes they don't give you enough data in the paper to do that, and it's infuriating, actually. Mm-hmm. But absolute risk is, let's use the example, right? It's sort of like, group 1 had, at the end of this study, a 5% risk of dying, and the other group had a 3% risk of dying. So what's the absolute risk? It's 5% in one group, 3% in another. So therefore, we have what's called the ARR, or the absolute risk reduction, is the delta between those two. So the ARR is 5% minus 3% is 2%. There was a 2% absolute risk reduction. And that's important to know because often what's only reported is the relative risk reduction, which is the absolute risk reduction over the non-exposure absolute risk. So in this case, the relative risk reduction would be whatever the absolute one was, I think 2% divided by the non-exposure risk, which is 5%. So that's 40%. So they had a 40% relative risk reduction going from 5% to 3%. So both of those things are important, but again, it's really critical that you know both. One of my favorite examples of this, of course, is the famous Women's Health Initiative, which was looking at the increase in the risk of breast cancer for the women who were receiving the estrogen and synthetic progesterone treatment. Now, notwithstanding the fact that, and we've talked about this 100 times, why I don't think that study was a good study in any way, shape, or form, and I don't think that study demonstrated there was any difference in risk. Statistically, here's what got reported. It got reported that the women receiving the hormone replacement therapy had a 25% increase in breast cancer. And that was true at a relative risk level. But the absolute risk difference was a difference of 5 women per 1,000 to 4 women per 1,000. So as you went from 4 cases of breast cancer per 1,000 women to 5 cases of breast cancer per 1,000 women, that is indeed an increase of 25%. 5 minus 4 is 1, divided by 4 is 0.25. But what's the absolute risk reduction, or in this case, risk increase? It's 1 over 1,000, or 0.1%. So, what I usually say to women when we're talking about hormone replacement therapy is you can kind of use that as your ceiling for the true risk increase of this therapy, even if you discount the 12 mistakes in that study that make it hard to believe that effect size would hold. So another way that we tend to measure effect size or association is using something called a hazard ratio. A hazard ratio actually involves some really complicated math that we're not going to get into. Something called a Cox proportional hazard, which I'm embarrassed to say I don't actually know the math anymore. There was a day when I did, and I remember it was not easy for me to learn. I had to go out and buy a bunch of books on statistics because even though my background's in math, I did not have a huge background in stats. And it wasn't like rocket science, but I remember really having to sort of understand the mathematics behind the Cox proportional hazard. The magic of the hazard ratio is it is temporal. So it captures the risk of something, i.e. the hazard, over time. And that differentiates it from something called an odds ratio, which can't do that, which only can measure kind of over the entire period of time, what is the risk. So at the risk of oversimplifying this a little bit, let's talk about the hazard ratio over a given period of time, but acknowledging that its real magic is its ability to tell you what's happening at any point in time. So let's just pretend we're talking about a cancer drug trial, and the hazard rates, i.e. the rates of disease progression, were 20% in one group and 30% in another group. So the people getting the drug progressed 20% of the time. The people not getting the drug, they're getting the placebo, progressed 30% of the time. So the hazard ratio is the ratio of 0.2 to 0.3, which is 0.667. So in other words, the treatment group was 67% as likely to experience disease progression as the control group. So now, again, you could flip the math and say, well, what if you saw the exact same rates, but in something that was desirable? So then it would be the 0.3 over the 0.2 would be 1.5. So your hazard ratio would be 0.15, which means there's a 50% increase in the benefit or the harm if it's something that's harmful. So you can look at the single number of a hazard ratio and you can determine what the increase or decrease in risk was. So Bob, I'll quiz you and you tell me and the listener how you're figuring this out. The hazard ratio is 0.82.
0.82. So let's say that you're comparing the experiment to the control, or the experimental group to the control. The experimental group has I would probably flip it. I would say they have an 18% reduced risk of whatever the event is you're talking about.
Very good.
Progression.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So
Thank you.
Give me one, Bob.
Nice. How about we'll go the other way, other side of the ledger, the other side of one. Hazard ratio of 2.2.
Okay, well that's a tricky one. If we said 1.8, it would be an 80% increase. 2.2 would be 120% increase. How are you doing that? You're taking 2.2, you're subtracting 1, and you get 1.2, and you multiply by 100%. And what you did earlier was when I gave you 0.82, you took 1 minus 0.82, and you got negative 0.18, which is a reduction of 18%. So again, you can just play with these for like 5 minutes. It's actually not that complicated, but you just have to do a bunch of them and become familiar with what those numbers mean. Now let's bring it back to the ARR thing. There's another common theme you'll hear about in trials called the number needed to treat, or the NNT analysis. And this gets back to the importance of absolute risk reduction. So remember let's say there's an example of, let's use the same numbers we used earlier just because they're familiar to me. But you've got a drug that the people who take it have 4 heart attacks per 1,000 people over a 5-year period. And then there's another, and then the placebo, they have 5 events over that same period of time per 1,000 people, right? So the drug reduces the events from 5 out of 1,000 to 4 out of 1,000. So what's the relative risk reduction there? The relative risk reduction is 20%, right? That's the 4 minus 5 divided by 5, in this case, is a 20% relative risk reduction. So you might say, this is something we should be putting in the drinking water. This is such an important thing, right? But you want to calculate how many people do you need to treat to prevent the event. And to do that, you have to take 1 and divide it by the absolute risk reduction, not the relative risk reduction. And the absolute risk reduction here is 0.01%. And 1 divided by 0.01% is 1,000. So now you have to treat 1,000 people to achieve the effect, which means you better figure out what the side effects are of that thing, what the cost of that thing is, what the complexity of it to justify it. There may be certain things for which a NNT of 1,000 is valuable, but you wouldn't say that across the board. So, conversely, if you have a drug that reduces the risk of death from 4% to 2%, or say 4% to 3%, then you would say 4 minus 3 is 1%. 1 divided by 1% is 100. If it took it from 4 to 2%, it would be 1 divided by 2% is 50. If it went from 4% to 1%, a reduction of death from 4% to 1%, your difference is 3%. You're now talking about an NNT of 33. As a general rule, we love to see drugs in that sub 100 range of NNT. We tend to not get that impressed when the NNT of something is like 1,000. So again, that's another way to think about the effect size.
Okay. That makes, I like the number needed to treat because it really, from a clinician's perspective or from a practical perspective, it's really telling it embedded in there, obviously, is the absolute risk and not just relative risk. So we went over p-values and confidence intervals a little. I don't think we went over confidence intervals as much as p-values. Do you want to stop and talk about confidence intervals?
Sure. Why don't you take this one? I need a drink.
Okay.
By the way, non-alcoholic, just for those listening. Drinking.
What are you drinking again?
I'm drinking my Gia with Topo Chico.
So confidence intervals are, technically intervals in which the population statistic could lie. So you've got, typically, I think what you see on a paper is this 95% CI. It's usually abbreviated, but it's a 95% confidence interval, and it's usually reported next to that hazard ratio that we just talked about. So whether say the hazard ratio is 0, the hazard ratio is 0.5, or 0.5, which means basically a halving of the risk, say in the experimental group versus the control group. And then you'll see this 95% confidence interval, and it might say, it might give you they'll give you these 2 numbers. And for example, let's just say it's 0.2 to 1.2 is your confidence interval. And the what that is that's the flip side of the significance level, which is 1 minus alpha. So it's 1 minus, so we talked about alpha being the p-value, but also being the false positive rate. So it's the flip side. So when you see 0.05 for your p-value, that's a tip-off that your confidence interval is 95%. And I think a lot of people think about the word confidence in this definition, and they take it to mean the probability that a specific confidence interval, so my example, I think it was 0.4 to say 1.2, that interval between those 2 numbers or between those 2 ratios contains the population parameter. So they think, okay, we could be 95% confident that the true effect of say meat consumption and cancer is between these 2 numbers. But that's not really what the confidence interval suggests. It's more of a suggestion. I don't think this often happens in practice, but if you were to take 100 different samples and compute this confidence interval, then approximately 95 out of those 100 will contain the true mean value.
Yeah, I mean, it's been described by some as an uncertainty interval rather than a confidence interval. There's another way to do this, which is just kind of the quick and dirty way to do this, is just to look at the confidence interval and ask if the interval contains 1 or not. So you gave an example a second ago, Bob. You said your hazard ratio was what?
Hazard ratio was 0.5.
0.5. Okay.
Yep, with a confidence interval of 0.4 to 1.2.
Okay, so that would not be significant. So even though your hazard ratio, you might look at that and say, oh, look, that's a big reduction. 0.5 hazard ratio means a 50% reduction. But your confidence interval was very wide, right? It was all the way from 0.4 up to 1 point something. So it crosses over unity. Conversely, if you had a hazard ratio of 0.5, but your confidence interval was 0.4 to 0.6 or 0.7 or even up to 0.9, you would say, indeed, that is not at the level of 95%, that is confident. So the other thing you'll notice, by the way, is the closer one edge of the confidence interval comes to 1, the closer the p-value is to 0.05. So when you have like a confidence interval that runs from 1.01 up to 2, your p-value is probably about 0.049 or something like that. Whereas when you have confidence intervals that are miles away from 1, the p-values tend to be very small.
Yeah, and I think so that statistician, Andrew Gelman, he talked about uncertainty intervals, and the reason why he says that is imagine you've got a huge confidence interval is what we call it. So big confidence interval, meaning instead of 0.4 to 1.2, it was like a 40% reduction at 0.4, or it went all the way out to like, say, 1,000. He would say like, that's a huge uncertainty interval. But the way that we think about confidence is, oh, that's a huge confidence interval. And it's maybe intuitively backwards for some people to think about it that way.
Yep, absolutely agree. The tighter the interval, the more confidence you actually have in it. And obviously, it can't cross 1.
The less uncertainty.
That's right. The less uncertainty there is. And when you get these monster ones, and this is why I like those sort of tornado graphs that you see in meta-analyses, where you visually get to see how much uncertainty existed in a given study. The confidence interval so the hazard ratio was, here's a great example. Hazard ratio was 1.4. Oh, wow, 40% increase. The 95% confidence interval went from 1.1 to 17. Well, I mean, do I really have a lot of confidence in that? No. That's an enormous uncertainty interval.
Yeah. And of course, you would want to know, okay, what are we talking about here? Absolutely, and not just relatively.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, look, I think the takeaway of this entire section is if you make the decision that you want to pay attention to science, you just have to roll up your sleeves and accept the fact that you're not going to be able to read these things in the bathtub, on a lazy Sunday morning. Like you kind of have to roll up your sleeves and pay attention to all of this little stuff. Now, it gets easier the more you do it. I think when I read a paper today, it's so much easier than it was 25 years ago. But you still have to kind of have your guard up for all of these things.
Yeah, I think you might learn something new from virtually every paper that you read. So I'm sure you you didn't read a paper 25 years ago and then you read your second paper today. You've read a multitude of papers, and in each one, there's probably something educational in there that you might pick up. And that probably goes to, I think, the beginning of the episode. You're talking about, I think, Tim asking, how do I get better at this? And it's probably like be consistent repetition.
Yeah,
read a paper, your favorite paper every week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can see that some of the stuff we've talked about here, I mean, we just went kind of deep into some statistics, and not even that deep, right? I mean, we didn't really explain what the Cox proportional hazard is and things like that. And we didn't differentiate odds ratios from hazard ratios, which requires getting into more math. But look, you still have to be able to kind of crunch some numbers sometimes. And it's unfortunate that I think a lot of people in the media don't know how to do this, and yet they're the ones that are reporting on these things. So if you're getting your science info from Twitter and from the news, it's there's a little bit of a buyer beware. where you have to understand the fact that it's very likely that the people that are reporting these things, not because they're necessarily not well intentioned, but they themselves might not be doing the type of analysis that's necessary.
Yeah. So another question we got is, do studies ever stop midway through? If so, what are the reasons?
Yes, they do, and they're generally kind of three reasons that studies are stopped. And again, we're really talking about kind of prospective clinical trials here. So the first and most important of these is safety. So remember, we talked about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Well, phase 1 is all about safety. Phase 2 is about efficacy and safety. Phase 3 is really about effectiveness and safety. But notice safety is in all of those. So absolutely, anytime there's a safety breach, which means there is a statistically significant difference between an important safety metric between the groups, that'll just stop the study. The second thing that will stop a study is benefit. So again, the Predimed example of when it was first done is it stopped 2/3 of the way through because it was deemed that there was such a benefit to the group on the Mediterranean diet relative to the low-fat diet that it would have been unethical to let those people in the low-fat diet continue for another 2.5 years on a diet that was so clearly increasing their risk of mortality. And then the final thing that will stop a study prematurely is futility. This is a little bit harder to understand, but it actually comes down to that hazard ratio concept, which is able to measure risk temporally and sort of in an aggregate fashion. So if 2/3 of the way through a study, there's no benefit, and statistically that nothing that's going to happen in the remainder of the study is going to change that, you stop the study. It's futile to continue the study. So those are basically your big three reasons why a study is going to be stopped.
I think a good example of stopping a trial for safety was, actually there's been several, but one of the CTEP inhibitors, torcetrapib. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly.
Yes, I remember this. I remember this really well. This is one of the few moments in science where I remember where I was standing when the result was announced. It was Q4 of 2006. I was at McKinsey at the time, and I was walking up Kearney towards California Street. And I heard the news of this, and I couldn't believe. I was so sure this was going to be a home run study.
Yeah. So in this case, the trial was set up with 7,500 patients about in each group. So they were on a CTEP inhibitor, and they're all on statins. So they're on Lipitor in particular. And so they compared the CTEP inhibitor to just Lipitor alone, which serves as a control group.
Well, it was actually the CTEP inhibitor plus Lipitor versus Lipitor alone. And this was a Pfizer study, which everybody thought was very cheeky of Pfizer because Lipitor was about to come off patent. And their way of sort of extending the life of it was saying, hey, when you pair the CTEP inhibitor with Lipitor, it's going to have a benefit. Because the background on this is that CTEP inhibitors raised HDL cholesterol. So it's like, we're going to take a drug, Lipitor, that lowers LDL cholesterol. We're going to pair it with a drug that raises HDL cholesterol. How could this possibly go wrong?
Famous last words. Yeah, so they intended to follow up patients. It's going to be about almost a 5-year trial, 4.5 years. And along the way, they'll have a review board that's looking at the results of the study. And in this case, they had a monitoring board that was looking at, in this case, they're looking at death, all-cause mortality. And they found that 82 patients receiving the drug combination had died compared with only 51 on Lipitor alone. And so they advised Pfizer to halt the trial at that point, which it did immediately, which it was just a little over a year into the trial when they did it. And in a way, it gets back to when you're talking about power analysis. The way that they do this is they have pre-specified p-values where they're kind of sneaking looks at the data. Like we talked about multiple hypothesis testing, that they're actually taking a few shots on goal in a way, because after 12 months, they're going to actually compare the two groups, see if this thing is a p-value of less than 0.01, depending on what they're looking at. And in this case, they had this pre-specified p-value of less than 0.01 based on a test for death from any cause. And they found that. And actually, the paper, there was still a published paper, even though the trial only went for 12 months in the New England Journal of Medicine, and they report those endpoints where the study was stopped.
Yeah, it's another discussion. In fact, I feel like Tom Dayspring and I, or Ron Krause and I, talked about this at length on one of our podcasts. I think it was Tom and I.
Did.
Yeah, that talked about this.
Yeah, I think it was Tom. I remember you.
Yeah.
So I remember you telling that story. Just a quick follow-up question. I guess was this the first CTEP inhibitor that was tested? Okay, and then you had the follow-up ones, and this I don't think we've really addressed this, but why would you do an observational study over a randomized controlled trial? In some cases, like a good example is try getting it past the IRB, a randomized controlled trial, and you're going to see going to give people a carton of Marlboros. They're going to smoke that over each day compared to a placebo group. It's unethical. And so with this, I don't know how many times they saw these adverse events with each CTEP inhibitor, and it's I guess the same drug class. They might have different mechanisms, but does there become a point where it's, I guess maybe that's why they have the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and they get past those barriers. But in a way, do you almost assume it might be unethical to run another CTEP inhibitor trial if you're seeing differences in death the last however many times?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's unethical, because I think they are basically saying, look, it's a different drug, and it's you can change one molecule on a drug, and it completely changes the way it works. You look at the COX-2 inhibitors, you look at Celebrex versus Vioxx. I mean, notwithstanding my views on that, which I talk about with Eric Topol on our podcast, but basically two drugs nearly identical, and one was far more efficacious, but also had side effects in a subset of people with hypertension. So I think the real question is, at what point do pharma companies say enough is enough? And I lost track. I feel like there were 3 CTEP inhibitors that were brought to phase 3. And ultimately, there was a Mendelian randomization that looked at CTEP mutations and really found that this was not going to be a good strategy. So, okay, so that's a good example that you brought up with respect to safety. And then we talked about benefit, which was Predimed. And then I think what happened in the Look Ahead trial, because I think Look Ahead was one that got stopped for futility, right?
Yes. Yep. That was one where they randomly assigned about 5,000 overweight or obese patients with type 2 diabetes. And it was an intensive lifestyle intervention. And they were looking at, what was the other, that was the intervention group. And then you had diabetes support and education in the control group. And their primary outcome, what they were looking at is basically what's called MACE. So death from cardiovascular causes, major adverse cardiovascular events. And I think they were going to look for 13 and a half, long trial, almost 14 years. And in this case, the trial was stopped just under 10 years. And it was based off of what's called a futility analysis that you explained.
Yeah, which basically means no matter what happens from this point on, this study will not be significant. So at the time that it was stopped, the hazard ratio was 0.95. So there was a suggestion of a 5% reduction in the risk of death from cardiovascular events, so in the right direction. But the 95% confidence interval, or uncertainty interval, if we're going to adopt that terminology, was 0.83 to 1.09. So it crossed 1. And so the p-value is going to be greater than 0.05. In fact, the p-value was 0.51 or something like that. I mean, it was basically complete chance. There was absolutely no effect. And again, no point in continuing.
Okay, so moving on to review process. What is the review process once a study is done to get a paper published in a journal?
So once the study is done and they've done their analysis and they write up a manuscript, they'll submit it to a journal for publication, and that journal will have an editor who will look to see if the paper meets their criteria, and if they think it's original and interesting, right? Is this paper adding something to the body of knowledge? At that point, the editor might just say, hey, this is not really a good fit for our journal, or for whatever reason, this is something we're not interested in any further. You're free to go and submit this elsewhere. But otherwise, the editor is going to invite individuals that are typically part of an editorial board to peer review the manuscript. So you hear this term all the time, right? Which is this a peer-reviewed publication? And that's important because not all things that get published have been peer-reviewed, and that's obviously the highest standard. So the reviewers are basically invited not randomly, but because they have some expertise in this area. But other things are important, right? You have to consider the conflicts of interest, and that they might have to decline if they're conflicted. And that's kind of a sticky topic because there are some really obvious conflicts, like financial conflicts of interest. But I think there's a whole deeper discussion about when you have sort of philosophical conflicts of interest with the person, and that gets into another area, which is peer review can be blinded or not blinded, right? It can be single blinded, where the reviewer knows who the author is, but the author doesn't know who the feedback is from. That tends to be very common. I think that's probably the most common one I've seen. They can be double blinded, where the reviewer doesn't know who it's being written by and vice versa, and they can be completely open. But again, the most common one that I've seen is single blinded. And so you'll typically have 3 reviewers review something, and they can either accept it outright, reject it outright, or make recommendations for revisions. And I think you'll see that as probably the most common thing, where they say, we're still interested in this paper, but did you actually consider this hypothesis? So sometimes the revisions are just repeat your analysis. Sometimes it's do another experiment. That won't be the case in a clinical trial, but if you're, I've had papers where that happened, where I had done a series of experiments and I'd written it all up and I'd submitted, and the reviewer came back and said, well, you really should have done this experiment as well, because this would have served as another control. So you go and repeat that experiment. Of course, when you're working in cell culture or something like that, it's not that onerous. And this process can go on several times, but ultimately, the editor makes a decision to accept that paper and publish it, or reject it again. And that's basically the process. And again, you're typically going to start at the top of the food chain. So you're typically, as an author, you're going to try to get your paper published in the most prestigious journal. I guess that's something we can talk about, what determines the prestige of a journal. But you'll sort of keep going down the pecking order until you can get it into the right journal. And sometimes right out of the gate, you just sort of know, like, hey, this is a publication that is really mechanistic, and it's really going to be geared towards, proceedings of the National Academy of Science, versus something that is really got enormous clinical implications and should go to JAMA or the New England Journal of Medicine. So there's a little bit of that's going on as well.
So to that end, every study that's out there, do they end up getting published?
No. In fact, many don't. And I think this is a really big problem, which is you have this thing called publication bias. So there's a very, very famous example of this that you and I have spoken about, which is the Minnesota Heart Study, right? And this is an example where a study was done. It ran from 1967 to 1973, if my memory serves me correctly.
I think so.
And it was looking at people who were in a residential care facility. So they had complete control over what these patients ate, and they were randomized to a diet of either normal saturated fat consumption or very low saturated fat consumption, where the saturated fat was substituted with polyunsaturated fats. And at the end of this 7-year study, of course, the hypothesis being the group that was substituted saturated fat for polyunsaturated fat would have lower cholesterol levels and lower cardiovascular death rate. And at the end in 1973, when the study concluded, they found that indeed the subjects who were given high amounts of polyunsaturated fats and low saturated fats did in fact have lower cholesterol levels, but their rates of cardiovascular deaths were significantly greater. And they didn't publish the study. That study would remain unpublished until 1989, some 16 years later. When asked why a 16-year delay in publishing that study, the lead author, I don't even remember who it was, begins with an F.
I think it's Ivan France.
Yeah, France, that's right. Yep.
There's a senior and a junior, yeah.
Yeah. He said the study didn't turn out the way we wanted it to. So that's kind of an egregious example of publication bias. In this case, a negative study, but I think there are a lot of studies that don't get published, even if they're negative. And that's a shame because when something doesn't work, it is just as important as when it does work. So it is unfortunate that not all studies get published because, again, just think about it this way. If you want to go out and do an experiment and 10 people have done that experiment before you and it's always failed, wouldn't it be great to know that? Would that impact your decision on whether or not you want to do the experiment a certain way, or would you want to try something a little bit different? So you can see very quickly this becomes problematic when papers don't get published.
Okay. So you've got this massive problem, publication bias. Do you know of any ways that can combat this?
I think there are a lot of people working on this problem. And I think one of the important steps is pre-registration, which we talked about at the outset, right? Which is you force investigators to pre-register their experiments on clinicaltrials.gov so that, and that's not just, here's my experiment, it's here are my statistical methods, here is my number of subjects, here's my primary outcome, here are my secondary outcomes, et cetera. And that basically makes it a lot harder to say, I'm not going to publish this when it comes out if it doesn't turn out the way I wanted it to.
And I think, and I don't know if there are particular journals that participate in this, but I imagine that they could make it a prerequisite that your trial must be pre-registered in order to be published in our journal. And if it's a journal, worth publishing in, it's probably not a bad idea.
Correct. So there's both requirements of journals and there's also requirements of funding entities, which say we won't fund you unless the study is pre-registered. I think that registered reports is a publishing format that an organization called the Center for Open Science, and I think that's the one founded by Brian Nosek. Is that his name?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, Brian would be a great guy to have on the podcast actually at some point.
Mm-hmm. So with registered reports, it pulls back. Basically, you submit your protocol, almost like the pre-registration. You submit that, and at that point, instead of after all the data is collected, it's peer reviewed. And if it's peer reviewed and accepted, based on you've got a high quality protocol, everything looks good, then it's provisionally accepted for publication. And so, like you said, like if it's a negative result and maybe that doesn't seem like it's worth publishing, or the journal's not going to publish it, they're basically making a decision if this is a positive or a negative trial, however it turns out, your protocol, your plan looks really good. And so we're going to accept it. We're going to basically accept it provisionally, provided that you don't start cutting corners and go away from this plan that we accepted. So you follow your plan, and it's like however the cards fall, it's already been accepted for publication.
Yeah, that's a pretty novel concept, actually. But again, I think it's all in the spirit of how do we make sure that we get rid of publication bias, positive result bias? Again, going back to what we said a second ago, you're far more likely to see something get published if it is a positive finding than if it's a negative finding, although negative findings are just as important for the establishment of knowledge, right? Let's use the CTEP inhibitor.
Yeah.
Imagine no one had ever published the studies demonstrating that CTEP inhibitors were at best neutral, at worst harmful. Again, studies of that magnitude can't escape publication, but think of all the bench research that can be going on, or the small early phase 1 trials that can be going on, or the preclinical stuff that's going on. It's very easy to kind of underreport things that are negative.
Yeah, and one other thing about the registered reports I was just thinking about, which gets to your power analysis. Like as an example, let's say that your study's underpowered. It would be great to have a group of your peers, more or less, say tear your study apart, but see if there's anything wrong with it. And they say like, your study is powered to detect like a 70% difference in all-cause mortality. In some, they might be pointing something out that basically saying your study's dead on arrival if you actually run it this way.
Right, because there's no way you're going to see an effect size greater than 30%, and yet you're only powered to detect it if it's 70%, which is crazy. So either change the experimental design, figure out a way to raise more money to do this study correctly. But yeah, that's a valuable tool.
Okay, and we touched on this. I think you talked about more reputable journals, and that's one of the questions is I think people know that certain journals are more respected than others, but is there a reason why in particular something's respected over another journal?
Yeah, there's something called an impact factor, and it's something that changes each year, meaning it's usually evaluated on a per year basis. So it's the ratio between the number of citations, total citations that point. So citing something is referencing that paper. So if you're writing a paper, you would say, well, Kaplan wrote such and such, and you cite that paper. It's a reference. So
great paper.
Yeah, great paper by Kaplan. So it's the ratio between the total number of citations that come to all articles published by that journal by the total number of articles published by that journal over a previous period of time. So it's typically done over a year. So you would say, okay, 27,000 citations came into the journals published out of that article out of 10,000 articles. So 27,000 divided by 10,000 would be 2.7. The impact factor would be 2.7. So to put this in context, there's, like 13,000 journals out there. 98% of them have an impact factor less than 10. About 95% of them have an impact factor less than 5. And about half of them have an impact factor less than 2. Just to give you kind of a sense of what impact factor looks like. And by the way, the tail on that is very asymmetric. So, the number of journals that have an impact factor of like 0.4, 0.7, 0.8, is incredibly high. So these are, if you look at the distribution of this, there's obviously a very long tail on the small end of this.
I've got a table here
that
I can pull up.
Yeah. Let's take a look at that, because I think it's pretty cool to look at this actually.
Got it.
So if you look at this table, you've highlighted the journals that have more than 100,000 citations. This is over, what year is this? 2019. So yes. You've got, the New England Journal of Medicine, which is kind of staggering, right? Nearly 350,000 citations. And we could do the math, but you can tell how many articles were published, because if you divide 347,000 by that number, you get 74.699. So that's the impact factor for the New England Journal of Medicine. The Lancet, 250,000 citations, impact factor 60. So you can sort of see, like, these are the top 28 journals by impact factor. There's kind of an outlier here, right? Which is the Cancer Journal for Clinicians, which has a staggering impact factor of 292, despite only having 40,000 citations. So that's a little bit of a skew. I don't really consider that to be sort of in the same league, because it's basically the Global Cancer Society statistic article, and therefore it reports on tons of cancer statistics, and therefore it doesn't really publish that much, but it gets referenced so much, because anytime someone is basically referencing a cancer statistic, they're going to reference that. So again, I kind of put that in its own little category. But what you can see here is, and the same, by the way, notice that the WHO technical report series has an impact factor of 59, but it's only cited like 3,500 times. And so it's cited a lot for a very few number of publications. But again, I think the ones that really matter here clinically, the New England Journal of Medicine, obviously Lancet, JAMA, are sort of your huge clinical ones.
Okay. So one more question about reading a scientific paper. So do you have a particular process when you read a paper? Do you just print it out and start to finish, start from the abstract and work your way through, or do you have a particular process in general?
Yeah, kind of. I generally do read the abstract first. And that kind of gives me a sense of, am I interested in this paper? The title of the paper is usually not sufficient for me to know if I'm going to be interested, but the abstract usually is my go, no go on that. So I could, read 10 abstracts in a matter of minutes and decide, how do I want to read 3 of these papers? The next decision I make is, how familiar am I with this subject matter? And if I'm not really familiar with it, I will read the introduction section. a lot of times I am relatively familiar with the subject matter, so I'll just skip the introduction section altogether, and I usually go straight to the methods section. And that gets into the details. So, okay, if this was an exercise study, and they did muscle biopsies, I just want to really get right down to it. So how many subjects were there? How were they randomized? What were the interventions? When were the biopsies taken? Was there a crossover? Blah, blah, blah. I just want to get into all that detail. The next thing I do is I look at the results section, but I start with the figures. So I just kind of go right into look at the figure and read the legend. And if the authors have done a good job, it's almost standalone at that point. So figures and tables should, in my opinion, be standalone. So the legend should explain everything you need to know. And of course, then reading the prose of the results section kind of adds a little bit more color to that. And then the last thing I do is I'll read the discussion section, because I'll by this point have formulated my own thoughts on what the strengths and weaknesses of the studies are, what questions remain, et cetera. But oftentimes the authors will have thought of things that I haven't thought of, or they'll thought of things that I disagree with, and so I'll kind of want to go through and do that. So that's my general framework for it, and you'll notice it's quasi-linear but not entirely linear.
Yeah, I like that. I like your example of figures. I can't remember, I might be misremembering, but did Steve Rosenberg, and this probably talks about like the importance of mentorship as well, did he have advice as far as, I think probably when you're writing a paper, how like your figures and what they should represent?
Yeah, that was our process. So when you finished an experiment, the very first thing you did was you made the figures and legends for the figures and tables. You made those and the legends first, and that's what you would go in and present to him, and you'd present that at at lab meeting rather. And you wouldn't really take pen to paper to write anything until you had that down. So you had to sort of know, what are the relevant figures, what are the relevant tables, can I explain them very concisely in a legend? And once you got that down, the paper kind of wrote itself, right? The methods is really easy to write, the results is easy to write, and sort of the last thing you would write would be the intro and the abstract. So, and again, I don't know that was just the way that I was taught to do it, and I found that to be very productive.
Okay, I think we've run the list of questions.
We got through them all, man. This was there's a lot in here, but I'm glad we did this. We've been sort of pushing this off for a couple of months now, but I think I'm glad we bit the bullet here.
Me too. Great topic.
All right, Bob. I'll see you next time.
All right, Peter. Thanks.
Bye.